Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about Crate Entertainment's action RPG, Grim Dawn. Thanks again to Virus the Mad Bar for bequeathing onto me the Forgotten Gods DLC and effectively spawning this episode. Join me as I go over this Eldritch abomination-riddled hellscape and find out if I loved the craftsmanship put into its world, or if I didn't enjoy it. Most stories don't begin with you getting lynched half to death, but then most also don't take place in a dismal Lovecraftian post-apocalypse. That said, in this particular case, your date with the hangman's noose is part of a rather unorthodox exorcism, the likes of which leaves you with some uncanny abilities courtesy of your former puppeteer. Abilities that you're now being press-ganged into using to the benefit of La Resistance in their desperate attempts to ward off the body-snatching phantoms and otherworldly aberrations waging war over the crumbling ashes of what remains of humanity. Honestly, the game lives up to its moniker rather well, providing both a backstory and main storyline, which are incredibly bleak. I genuinely enjoyed talking to NPCs and doing the questlines to learn more and experience the narrative, and I frequently took the time to scour the maps in search of just scattered lore pages, which provided even more tidbits to read over. I was also pretty fond of all the additions to the story that came from the Ashes of Malnoth and Forgotten Gods DLC. Like, there's a large chunk of stuff to dig your teeth into narratively, and even some stuff which will require you to make different choices to see everything, requiring either different characters or playthroughs on a higher difficulty mode. Which is phenomenal, because it's actually so story-rich, it is a genuinely tempting option. But yeah, sidetracking off to gameplay, honestly Grim Dawn does the whole action RPG stick of running around and murdering things by clicking on them gig rather well. Combat does start out simple enough, but not only is there a wide array of weapons at your disposal, there is a veritable plethora of both active and passive abilities you'll get to play with. And you'll get the opportunity to experiment with this early on, considering you gain skill points rapidly at first, allowing you to dabble in the various classes to figure out just what you enjoy. And yes, there's the ability to respec in case you end up hating everything. Honestly, I ended up using it simply because each class in and of itself has a large amount of synergies and different ways to play them, and that's without the fact that you gain access to a secondary class to dive into as you progress into the game, allowing a fairly absurd amount of class combinations and altogether unique ways to play. And then when you factor in the devotion system, which allows players to use skill points they acquire from purifying shrines, think little challenge markers, to round out the character development with stat boosts as well as passive skills that attach to their existing skills, you end up with an absolutely vast array of builds at your disposal, which is then further amplified by the fact that you can actually get skills attached to certain bits of equipment as well as items you can craft, which makes multiplayer a fair bit more appealing, since when you're playing with your friends, even if they're the same class as you, they can still end up playing entirely differently and yet in an altogether complementary style. And of course, there's also the ever-present staple of friggin' loot pinatas, so much that for those folks who crave rare weapons to plunder and set pieces to steal, those very much exist. Now, I typically have some pretty bad luck with drops, so I was more partial to the fact that you can just customize your gear a little bit to better tailor your strategies as mentioned prior. Honestly though, the thing I really enjoy is just the fact that you have shared storage between your characters, which means if you find a number of good pieces of gear for a certain class, you now have a very good reason to go and dabble into it. But even beyond all of the class shenanigans, providing a large amount of replay in and of itself, there's a sheer amount of content in the game to help just keep you going. Like, the main storyline is fairly lengthy in and of itself, with a ton of bosses and mini-bosses to confront, but there's also an absolutely massive amount of side content to do. Side quests, which will see you scouring the various areas, side dungeons, which contain challenging modifiers, even post-game confrontations which scale up with your level and put you up against enemies which are so gravely lethal they'll test your abilities to their utmost. There's also some pretty spiffy super bosses to beat up if you feel the compulsive need to suplex the biggest, baddest abominations to roam the world. And if you're absolutely hankering for a dire amount of murder, there's also some gauntlets for you to fling yourself at, in case you want to find out just how efficient your build is to farm up some levels, or just to amass obscene levels of wealth. Though, admittedly, some of these are tied to the other post-game element, which is faction grinding. See, Grim Dawn has a faction system, which rewards players by increasing how much human factions like you as you kill their enemies, and intensifies the odium of monstrous factions as you kill their friends. Convincing people to like you provides some neat boons in the case of extra quests, as well as interesting bits of gear which are otherwise unacquirable, but it's the monster factions that really change things up. See, as you continue to vex the faction by picking off their denizens, you also increase their overall threat level, causing them to spawn bigger and badder bosses at an increasing frequency until it ultimately culminates in the ability for them to send a monstrous super boss to clean your clock and mop the floor with you. It's sort of really rewarding in a violent way. Now, in the sound department, there's a lot to like. For one thing, there's some absolutely great ambient tracks that'll help accompany your quest to genocide everything from beyond the pale of humanity's comprehension, but there's actually some solid voice acting and sound effects to boot. Furthermore, Grim Dawn is a good-looking game, with a solid amount of areas and enemy diversity, but what I really dug about it is the fashion. Because honestly, the fact that all the various bits of armor and weapons have their own graphics, so you can entirely set yourself up to wear the ugliest combination of rainbow pimp armor imaginable. I mean, yes, there's also an option to modify your appearance with items you've already found, but no, I didn't ever really use it. I was always wearing ugly rainbow pimp armor. Anyways, what I'm basically saying is that I'm rather fond of Grim Dawn. Whilst I don't normally find myself diving into action RPGs that often, I did find myself thoroughly engrossed enough to acquire all of the DLC over time, and to do my utmost to finish them at least on the base difficulty, and in some instances, well into the additional difficulties. I'm also immensely fond of the detail that's been placed into the world building, both in the dialogue and just story kernels that exist within the main quests, as well as the optional lore that can be found. Now, I'll admit, I was completely overwhelmed by it at first, since there's a lot to learn mechanically, but that ends up being a part of its charm, because there's just so much to actually do in the game. It gives you opportunities to learn and to adjust your strategies to face off against the wailing horrors that populates its various blasted landscapes. If anything, the only regret I have is that I didn't play with more friends. Possibly because one of the character setups I had was incredibly self-destructive and would have been funnier with accomplices. Yeah, that. Anyways, ultimately, I'd place Grim Dawn as a hit because it's an immensely satisfying and incredibly solid ARPG to dive into that I feel practically obliged to try and finish fully. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, podcasts, or Monday TTRPG content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord. You can click the link in the banner or the description so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a coffee running now to help supplement funds for our lovely editor Jack, and to make sure we can continue to provide quality content. Again, you can check the description and the banner for them links. That said, I'll catch y'all in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.